A German shepherd broke through the blizzard sweeping down over Silver Creek, limping slightly, his coat dusted with frost and old scars that told their own history. He should have stayed by the fire, but something deeper than instinct pulled him into the darkness. Beneath the iron cap bridge, a young officer lay bound and fading fast, the river ice moaning beneath the weight of steel and cold. No one saw the dog coming. No one imagined that a retired K-9, forgotten by most, would sense what the storm was trying to bury. The shepherd remembered the scent of duty, the echo of a night when a faithful partner had once dragged him back from the edge of death. What happened next would make you cry, and remind you that miracles still walk quietly among us, even in the coldest places. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. And if you believe that no human or animal should ever be left behind, hit subscribe, because the next rescue might just change how you see loyalty forever. The storm arrived first as a whisper, thin and sharp as glass, sliding down from the Bitterroot Peaks and curling into the narrow valley where Silver Creek slept beneath a frozen roof. Street lamps along Main flickered like weary sentinels, their amber light trembling across snowbanks piled high against shuttered shops. The hardware store had long since taken down its entry chimes for fear they'd freeze and snap in the wind. Across the street, the old diner still clung to life, its hand-painted sign promising, coffee hot as August, and somehow delivering something even fiercer on nights like these. Outside the town's edge, where the two-lane road climbed toward the timberline, a lonely cabin huddled among wind-gnarled firs. The place had the stubborn look of something that had learned to lower its shoulders and let the weather swing first. Inside, Michael Rohr sat at a rough-hewn pine table with his back to the wood stove and his eyes half on the door, as if doors were things that sometimes changed their minds. Mike, to the handful of locals who'd earned the right to say it, was 35, tall in the way that always looked ready to stand, and lean in a way that suggested years of carrying weight that wasn't always his own. Time in the Marine Corps had carved quiet into his face, fine sunlines at the eyes, a pale scar riding along the ridge of one knuckle, and a calm around the mouth that made others feel safer without knowing why. His dark hair was cut short more from habit than preference, and his hazel eyes seemed to look past people, into the place where their next decision waited. Mike wasn't unfriendly. He simply saved his words for when they mattered. Around town, folks would have described him as careful, polite, and, on certain days when old noise stirred in his head, just a little far away. On the braided rug beside the stove, a German shepherd dozed with the practiced vigilance of an old soldier in disguise. His name was Ranger, 7 years old, a black and tan map of muscle and memory stitched over a frame built for speed and endurance. His winter coat glowed like burnished copper in the stove's light, and one ear bent at a permanent tilt from an old fracture, a flaw that softened an otherwise noble face. Ranger's eyes were amber, sharp and patient. When they settled on Mike, there was devotion in them, steady and gravitational, as if deciding which way down should be. He was disciplined but never cold. His loyalty carried small sparks of humor, a head tilt at a clumsy boot, a sigh when Mike insisted on fixing what should have been replaced. He had a soft spot for the crinkle of chip bags and a hard line against coyotes that strayed too close to the tree lean. Before he belonged to Mike, Ranger had served. He knew commands in 2 languages, and one unspoken one, the quiet understanding between 2 souls who had survived the same long night. The wind hummed through the cabin seams, thin and restless. Mike reached for his mug, found it gone from warm to memory, and didn't mind. The cold didn't bother him as much as the sound of it, the way it scraped against thoughts and left them raw. He tossed another split log into the stove and watched the light turn Ranger's coat the color of late honey. "Storm's coming hard," he said, not as a warning, but as a courtesy to the old wood, and to the ache in his right hand that always returned when the pressure dropped. Far down the valley, a snowplow's engine droned, a heartbeat muffled by distance. Then Mike's phone, kept more for weather than people, buzzed on the counter. Blizzard warning, gusts to 60 miles per hour. Whiteout conditions likely. Travel discouraged. He silenced it and set it face down. Ranger's ears twitched. The change was subtle, a muscle tightening, a breath paused, but Mike felt it the way sailors feel a shift in a wave. He stopped pouring the kettle and waited, still and wordless, because looking at a dog in a moment like this makes him think you need reassurance instead of information. Ranger rose, fluid and certain, shook once like a craftsman clearing sawdust from his sleeve, and padded to the door. This wasn't curiosity. It was certainty. "What is it, partner?" Mike asked, because questions keep the air open. Ranger stood with his nose inches from the latch, breathing slow and deliberate, as though the door were a page full of tiny urgent print. Outside, the wind surged, then retreated, like a tide growing shy. Beyond it, there was almost nothing, a branch shedding snow, a drift collapsing, ice cracking on the creek. But Ranger knew the grammar of those sounds, how the creek broke when it was alone, and how it broke when it wasn't. He lifted a paw, set it down again, then let out a soft, uneasy whine that said the next hour wasn't going to obey the ordinary rules. Mike's greatest gift had always been his ability to hesitate without freezing. On patrols, that instinct had kept him alive. At home, it kept him from mistaking shadows for visitors. He set the kettle aside and stepped to the door, and for a moment, because memory loves doorways, he fell backward into a different kind of cold. The desert had its own winter. A night that felt like ice. He remembered a convoy halting mid-sentence, the smell of hot metal and dust, the sweetness of a ruptured battery, then a pop, too close, too bright. Heat that didn't just burn, it rearranged what you thought was fixed inside you. He remembered smoke, orders, the silence under the orders, and a shape low to the ground moving through it all, a form of grace given spine and fur. That dog hadn't been Ranger yet, not his, not anyone's, but the eyes were the same. Work lit from the inside. He remembered the tug at his vest, the hard shove out of the kill zone, the weight of a body that refused to leave him behind. He remembered a human cry turning back into a human voice because a dog wouldn't let it die there. Some nights, Mike believed Ranger had saved him twice, once overseas, and once back home, when silence had teeth. He blinked the memory back into its crate, never locked, just latched, and opened the door. Cold rushed in like it had been waiting. It smelled of torn pine and static. Snow was falling the way a sky falls when it runs out of doubt. The nearest streetlight was a mile away, but its faint glow shimmered over the valley like a crown of dying gold, flickering as the wind gnawed at the lines. "Easy," Mike murmured, though the word was mostly for himself. Ranger looked up, ensuring the way was clear, then pressed his shoulder against the frame and slipped out into the storm. "Ranger," Mike said sharply, "because names are leashes." The shepherd paused at the porch edge, head high, nose cutting through the snow's churn. Then, without hesitation, he leapt down, black and tan against white, stitching a single purposeful line toward the trees. Mike swore under his breath, a word that might have been a prayer if you were generous. He grabbed his coat from its nail, old canvas over quilted flannel, the kind a man keeps because it fits the life he became after the battles were done. Boots, headlamp, pack, reflex took over. He swung the door wide. The wind caught it and returned it like a challenge. The world outside was both nearer and farther than before, snow thickening, cutting sideways, stinging against his jaw. He flicked on the lamp, sweeping the beam over the landmarks, stacked firewood, the half-finished birch stool, the fence post bent like an old man searching for his dropped coin. Ranger was already a dark flicker near the tree-line. Mike lifted 2 fingers to his lips and whistled, their signal for hold. For one heartbeat, Ranger froze, chest rising hard, and turned back. The light caught his eyes, no panic, no play, just urgency. Work had arrived. The town would tell its own version of that night later. Some would say the power blinked twice right at 10. Others would swear they saw plow trucks drifting like ghosts through walls of snow. The diner's owner, a compact woman with biceps forged from lifting cast iron and hearts, would insist the neon coffee cup in her window went dark, then flared again like a wink from a weary saint. But none of them saw the man at the forest's edge. None saw the way his breath punched white steam into the wind as he weighed the impossible math between caution and trust. And none saw the dog waiting, utterly still, not with impatience but with that quiet, total attention only working dogs and small children ever truly master. Mike stepped down into the yard, snow squeaking beneath his boots, the kind of sound that means the air's gone knife-sharp and dry. He thought about the road, about the drift cuts and the way the creek froze into uneven shelves. He thought about the weather warning on his silenced phone, and about the foolishness of men who believed they could negotiate with winter. But then he thought of amber eyes in the desert and a tug on his vest. He thought of now. Bravery, he knew, didn't feel like being large. It felt like being exactly the size of the narrow door you had to pass through. He closed the cabin door, letting the latch kiss home, then swung his pack over one shoulder. Inside were the essentials: headlamp batteries, trauma kit, spare mitts, 2 chemical warmers, 50 feet of paracord. "All right, Ranger," he muttered. "Show me." The shepherd dipped his head in acknowledgement, whether nod or instinct, Mike never knew, and vanished between the firs, his body melting into the storm's darkness. Mike followed. Behind him, far down the slope, the lamps along Main Street sputtered and flared again, struggling to keep their ancient promise of light. Ahead, the forest accepted them both without ceremony. Snow erased their tracks almost as fast as they formed them. The storm rolled over Silver Creek with that peculiar cruelty only mountain weather understands, neither quick nor merciful, just relentless. It blurred the valley into gray silhouettes, every shape untrustworthy, every sound smothered. At the far edge of town, in a brick building that had survived 40 winters, the Silver Creek Sheriff's Department fought its own kind of cold. Inside, the air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and old paper. A baseboard heater hummed in protest against the chill creeping through the walls. Deputy Laura Bennett sat at a scarred oak desk beneath the green glow of a banker's lamp, drumming restless fingers against a folded county map. She was 31, lean and wiry, her frame shaped by years of training but still carrying a runner's grace. Her sandy blonde hair was pulled into a tight ponytail, accentuating the angles of her face. Hazel eyes, quick, observant, unwilling to miss detail, darted between the map and the clock. Laura had grown up here, the daughter of a miner who never returned from a cave-in. That loss had carved something permanent into her, a kind of quiet defiance against fate. It made her brave, blunt, and sometimes too stubborn for her own good. Spread before her was the county's northern grid, the edges worn soft from years of use. A red marker traced a winding route through the back roads that cut across the northern ridge. Tire tracks had been reported out there, places where no one should be driving unless they had something to hide. Her finger rested on one dot scribbled in the margin. Iron Cap Bridge. An old crossing, rusted and forgotten since the logging companies left. The road near it had gone unplowed for years, a perfect place to disappear. She checked her watch. 10:47 p.m. Officer Daniel Hayes was 2 hours overdue. Daniel was the department's youngest, 29, earnest, careful but gutsy. The kind who carried both confidence and doubt in equal measure. Laura had vouched for him when he joined, maybe because she recognized something familiar in him, a young cop trying too hard to prove he belonged. She stared at the silent phone, willing it to ring. Wishing he'd stroll through the door with that sheepish half-grin that usually followed a mistake. The door creaked open. Sheriff Tom Grady stepped out of his cramped office, a styrofoam cup of coffee clutched in one hand. He was 60 now, his frame softened by diner breakfasts and years spent carrying the weight of other people's bad nights. His thick mustache was gray as old smoke. Lines framed his eyes like parentheses earned from too much listening. "Still nothing?" he asked. Laura shook her head. "No call-in since before dusk." He was checking the ridge roads, but the storm rolled in faster than predicted. Her jaw tightened. "He never misses check-in, Tom." Grady sighed, setting the coffee down. "Could be the snow. Radios cut out fast in this weather." His tone was calm, too calm. Laura knew that voice, it was the same one he used at accident scenes when he was trying to sound sure for someone else's sake. But the flicker in his eyes betrayed him. Storm or not, she pressed, he would have signaled. You and I both know he wouldn't just go dark. If he saw something. She stopped herself, the words heavy with implication. Her finger tapped the map again, Iron Cap Bridge. Grady rubbed the back of his neck and looked toward the evidence board, photographs, faded case notes, plastic baggies pinned under thumbtacks, meth stashed in toolboxes, trucks with false bottoms, scribbled names in the margins. Silver Creek wasn't a hotbed of crime. But its back roads. They had been used before. By smugglers who counted on storms for cover. Daniel had been sent to monitor whispers about those very routes. Across the room, Sergeant Paul McKenna, mid-40s, tall and broad, thinning hair, steady hands, lifted his head from a stack of reports. A quiet man who defused drunks with patience instead of fists, he spoke now with the clarity of habit. If Hayes is overdue, we need to run his last coordinates. If he's stuck, he won't last long in this. Grady hesitated, but nodded. Do it. Laura spun the old desktop computer toward her. The machine groaned awake, fans whirring, the screen flickering between blue and static. She entered Daniel's call sign and waited for the network to catch up. Finally, a blink of coordinates. Last ping, 48 hours ago. Northern Ridge. Iron Cap Bridge. Laura leaned back, exhaling. That bridge again. The sheriff frowned. Place is falling apart. No reason for him to be out there. Unless he saw something, she countered. It's exactly where smugglers would hide. No patrols. No traffic. Storm rolling in to cover their tracks. Grady didn't argue, he couldn't. He knew the pattern, and he knew silence could be deadly. Still, the thought of sending more deputies into a storm like this made his shoulders tighten. Laura pushed the map toward him, voice steady but urgent. Sheriff, if Daniel's out there, he's in trouble. This isn't bad luck, it's deliberate. And you know what kind of people we're dealing with. The office fell silent except for the hum of the heater and the wind clawing at the windows. Finally, Grady nodded. Slow. Reluctant. We'll form a team. But not until this storm lets up. I'm not losing another deputy to a whiteout. Laura bit back her frustration. She understood. Years ago, Grady had lost a young deputy in a search just like this, swallowed by the storm, never found. That scar still guided every decision he made. She turned back to the map. Her eyes fixed again on Iron Cap Bridge. Daniel wasn't just late. He was lost. The forest had narrowed into a tunnel of black and white. Fir trunks loomed like silent witnesses while the snow fell harder, layering silence upon silence. Ranger moved ahead with the precision of something born for this. His shoulders rolled under the weight of his thick coat, his paws punching clean tracks through drifts already knee-deep. Each breath burst from him in quick clouds that vanished into the storm. Behind him, Mike pushed through the cold, every step a negotiation between muscle and ice. His headlamp swung in an arc, a restless searchlight carving patterns across the trees. Then, out of the snow's blindness, the Iron Cap Bridge appeared. It didn't rise from the dark all at once, but in pieces, a corroded rib of steel, a lattice of beams, the broken skeleton of something that had once carried the living safely over the river's roar. Now the river below was still, sealed under a crust of ice that glimmered faintly in the dying light, like cracked glass laid over a grave. Ranger halted at the clearing, ears high, tail rigid. His body went statue still. Mike caught up, chest heaving, his breath fogging in heavy bursts. "What is it, boy?" he called, though a part of him already knew, the kind of wrongness that hums in your teeth before your brain names it. Ranger lowered his head, sniffed once, twice, then gave a sharp, deliberate bark that cut through the storm like a signal flare. The sound ricocheted off the steel girders, echoing into the ravine below. He barked again, shorter, louder, then bounded forward, claws clattering on frozen metal. "Ranger!" Mike shouted, but the wind devoured the word. He followed, testing each step across the iced-over planks. The bridge moaned beneath him, the sound of age remembering its weight. His gloved hand slid along the rail as his headlamp swept over the edge, down into the void below. Something caught the beam. A shape. Human. At first, it looked like debris caught in the ice, dark fabric, tangled limbs. But as the light steadied, the truth clawed its way into focus. A man lay twisted at the base of the bridge, half buried under snow and shadow. His uniform jacket was torn open at the shoulder, darkened by blood. His wrists were bound tightly behind him with nylon rope that bit deep into the skin. His ankles were tied the same way. A rag of cloth, stiff with frost, gagged his mouth. Mike's heart stuttered. Jesus! He focused the beam on the man's face. Even swollen and bruised, he recognized him, Officer Daniel Hayes. Mike shouted over the wind, "Hold on, kid. We've got you." Ranger was already there. He had slid down the incline, claws scraping ice, body low for balance. Reaching the officer, the shepherd pressed himself against the man's chest, curling into him to share warmth. He lowered his muzzle and licked gently at Daniel's frozen cheek. The motion stirred the young officer's eyelids. They fluttered, barely, but enough to tell life still clung there. Mike's hands tightened around the rail until his knuckles burned. Training kicked through panic like muscle memory: assess, stabilize, signal. But the slope was treacherous, sheer, slick, a single wrong move away from disaster. If he tried to descend without gear, he could end up crashing straight into them. So he crouched at the edge, shouting, "Stay with him, Ranger." The shepherd answered not with sound but with movement, pressing himself harder against Daniel's side, his breath steaming in rhythm with the man's faint, irregular ones. Daniel drifted in and out of awareness. The cold had made him dream sluggishly, shards of memory and fear. He heard the barking first, sharp against the wind, and part of him thought it was a trick of dying nerves. But then came warmth. Wait. A heartbeat that wasn't his. Something alive had found him. He tried to move, but the ropes dug into his wrists, the cold biting so deep he couldn't tell where his hands ended. He tasted blood and ice. Ranger barked again, an order this time. "Stay awake." Above, Mike's beam caught the shepherd's eyes, two golden coals in the dark. The sight almost broke him. The dog wasn't panicking, wasn't waiting for instruction. He was working. Choosing. Keeping another life alive because no one else could. The wind roared harder, shoving at the bridge until the steel complained in long, metallic groans. Mike knew he needed rope, an anchor, something to get down safely. He took one last look at Ranger and turned away from the edge, sprinting toward the tree lean where the wind bit less savagely. He tore off a glove with his teeth and fumbled inside his pack for a battered satellite phone, military issue, old but reliable. The screen flickered to life, its faint glow trembling against his breath. He scrolled through the contacts burned into memory and stopped at a name. Dr. Evelyn Clark. She answered on the third ring, her voice clipped, composed. "Clark. Doc, it's Mike Rohr," he said quickly, nearly shouting over the wind. "Found a downed officer under Iron Cap Bridge. He's alive, but barely. Ranger's keeping him warm. I can't reach him without rope and an anchor." He heard pages turning on the other end, maps or notes. "How long's he been out there?" "Don't know," Mike answered. "Beaten, tied up, hypothermic. I can't do this alone." A pause, then her voice came back, firm as a command. "Listen to me, Marine. Meet me at Ridge Trailhead in 20 minutes. Bring rope, flare, and a working radio. Don't move the boy until we're both there. If Ranger's keeping him warm, that's his best chance. Copy, Mike said, nodding even though she couldn't see him. And Mike, she added, her tone softening for a heartbeat, don't let that Marine pride get you killed. This isn't Fallujah, it's a Montana blizzard. Keep your head. Then the line went dead. Mike stared at the phone, the cold seeping through his gloves, then shoved it back into his pack. Evelyn had always spoken to him that way, direct, unsparing, but never without care. They had met years ago, when Ranger was fresh out of service, body wrecked by shrapnel, gait uneven from a wound that should have ended his work. Evelyn had looked at the shepherd once and said, that dog's not done yet. She'd been right. Now both of them, two soldiers from different wars, were being called back to service. Mike checked his pack. 50 feet of climbing rope. 2 flares in weatherproof tubes. A hand radio with a spare battery. Not much. But enough to buy time. He slung the pack over his shoulder and started back toward the bridge. Below, Ranger hadn't stopped. The shepherd worked the way only veterans do, steady, relentless, refusing to yield. His jaws worried at the nylon bindings, teeth grinding at the frozen fibers. He tugged, chewed, pawed, growling low each time the rope refused to give. Steam curled from his mouth and nose. His breath warmed Daniel's cheek. Every few moments he'd pause to lick at the officer's face, urging him back toward consciousness. Daniel stirred weakly, his swollen eyes rolling beneath lashes iced shut. Memories flickered, headlights in snow, fists, the burn of rope, then the darkness swallowing him whole. He had thought he would die here, alone, forgotten. But something had refused to leave him. The barking came again, steady, rhythmic, like the beating of a stubborn heart. Above, Mike crouched once more at the bridge's edge, watching the shapes below. When he saw Ranger clawing at the cords, something inside him cracked. "Good boy," he whispered. The words were swept away by the storm, but maybe the wind carried them where they needed to go. He struck a flare. It hissed and spat a red glow against the snow, a desperate beacon marking their position. Funny, he thought, he'd once sworn never to take orders again. Never to wait for someone else's command. And here he was, ready to fall into line at a medic's word, because sometimes survival still needed a chain of trust. The wind shrieked through the bridge, rattling bolts until the structure moaned like a living thing. Mike leaned into the railing, clutching his radio. "Hang in there, Ranger," he murmured. "Help's coming." Down below, the shepherd gave one last furious jerk of his head. The rope frayed, split, and a faint surge of blood moved back into Daniel's hands. The young officer gasped through the gag, breath shallow but there. Ranger nosed against his chest again, pressing hard, anchoring life where it tried to slip away. And above them, under the glow of the dying flare, Mike waited, one man, one dog, and one fading pulse defying the storm. The red flare hissed and spat against the snow, its light painting the steel beams of the iron cap bridge in ghostly crimson. Mike crouched at the railing, the flare's smoke curling past his face, stinging his eyes. His breath came in ragged bursts, but he didn't move, his gaze locked on the dark below, where Ranger pressed himself like a living shield against the fallen officer. The snow kept falling, thick and relentless, swallowing every trace of sound until the world seemed to shrink to the flare's circle of red and the heartbeat pounding in Mike's ears. He looked toward the tree line, where the trail dropped out of sight. Evelyn would come. He knew she would. Minutes passed, each one dragging like an hour, until finally a distant glow bobbed through the storm, steady, rhythmic, growing brighter. A beam of light cut through the snow, swinging closer until it caught the shape of a tall figure pushing against the wind. Dr. Evelyn Clark moved with the kind of focus that came from decades of answering cries for help in impossible conditions. Her parka, streaked white with frost, flared with reflective strips under her headlamp. A heavy canvas medic's bag hung against her hip, bumping with every stride. She reached the bridge without hesitation, her breath visible, her face half hidden by her hood's fur lining. Strands of silver hair caught the flare's reflection like spun glass. Her gray eyes, sharp and disciplined, took in the scene at a glance. "You weren't exaggerating," she said, crouching beside Mike, voice calm despite the storm. "Weather's bad enough to eat a man whole." Mike pointed down into the ravine. "He's there. Rangers with him. Kids barely breathing. I've got to get down." Evelyn followed his gesture, her gaze tracing the rope he'd already anchored to a steel girder. She gave a quick nod. "You did good work. We'll do this by the book. You descend, I follow. You free him, I stabilize." Without waiting for an answer, she unzipped her medic's bag, revealing a perfectly organized arsenal: thermal blankets, chemical warmers, gauze, 4 kits, and field splints, each packed with surgical precision. The sight steadied Mike. She was the same as always, calm in chaos, efficient under fire. They moved fast, attaching harnesses, checking knots, testing anchors. Years of shared discipline turned their motions into muscle memory. Mike clipped into the line first. Evelyn watched as he leaned back, testing the rope, then gave a short nod. "Go." The rope squealed against frozen steel as he eased over the edge, boots searching for footholds on the icy wall. Snowflakes spun past him, bright in the red glow of the flare. His fingers burned from the cold as he gripped the rope, descending inch by inch. When his boots finally hit the ravine floor, the shock of it stole his breath. The world down here was quieter, dimmer, an underworld of ice and shadow. He turned his lamp and froze. Officer Daniel Hayes lay half-curled on his side, the frost clinging to his lashes and lips, his uniform stiff with ice. The ropes had begun to fray at the wrists where Ranger had chewed them raw. The dog was draped across him like a weighted blanket, body trembling with effort but refusing to move. His fur glittered white under the falling snow. When he saw Mike, he raised his head weakly, eyes glowing amber in the beam, and gave one short whine as if to say, "Finally." Mike dropped to his knees beside them. His gloves fumbled with the knots, frozen solid, crusted in ice. He pulled out his knife and began sawing carefully at the cords. "Hang in there, kid," he muttered, breath fogging. "You're not done yet." Above, Evelyn's voice echoed faintly. "Vitals?" "Cold as hell," he called back. "Still breathing, but barely. Pulse is weak." The final cord snapped. Daniel's wrists came free, leaving deep red grooves across pale skin. Mike peeled the gag from the officer's mouth and tilted his head slightly to open the airway. Daniel made a sound, a wet, broken gasp, and his chest shuddered as breath came in shallow, stubborn waves. Evelyn's rope groaned as she descended with practiced precision, her boots hitting the ice beside them in a small spray of snow. She landed lightly, unhooking from the harness before Mike could even turn. She knelt beside Daniel immediately, her presence bringing a strange calm to the chaos. The storm still howled, but around her, everything seemed to narrow into purpose. "Pulse thready," she murmured, checking his neck. "Severe hypothermia, shock. We've got minutes, not hours." "Blankets," Mike said, already digging through his pack. "Good," she answered. "Foil sheets, then warmers. I'll start fluids." They worked in sync, Mike unwrapping thermal blankets while Evelyn slid chemical warmers beneath Daniel's armpits and along his chest. The foil crackled under the wind like distant thunder. Evelyn unzipped her bag again, her gloved hands astonishingly steady as she prepped in 4-line. Not a single motion wasted. Ranger shifted closer, pressing his body along Daniel's torso, nose nudging his jaw as though unwilling to relinquish responsibility. Evelyn glanced at him and, for the first time that night, smiled. "Good boy," she said softly. "You bought him time." The shepherd blinked, eyes heavy with exhaustion, but didn't move away. Daniel stirred faintly, his cracked lips parting. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. His eyes, swollen but aware, flickered between Ranger, Evelyn, and finally Mike. Evelyn leaned close, her voice warm but firm. "Save your strength, officer. You're safe now." Mike pressed the radio to his chest and keyed it. "Silver Creek Dispatch, this is Roar at Iron Cap Bridge. Officer down, multiple injuries, hypothermic. Request immediate medevac. Coordinates transmitting now." Static hissed through the wind before a distant voice crackled back. "Copy that, Roar. Rescue sled en route. ETA 30 minutes. Mike exhaled, his breath shaking. Relief, thin but real, threaded through the exhaustion. Together, he and Evelyn adjusted Daniel's position, tucking blankets tighter, shielding his face from the snow. But the storm didn't ease. The wind whipped around the bridge like it wanted to peel the world apart. As Mike shifted to secure Daniel's legs, something in the snow near the ravine's mouth caught his eye. Tire tracks. Deep, wide, heavy. Not the pattern of any county plow or emergency vehicle. These belonged to something built for hauling weight, modified, deliberate. He crouched, brushing the snow away with his glove. The tracks curved sharply toward the woods. Whoever had left Daniel here hadn't fled in panic. They'd left in confidence, believing the storm would bury both man and evidence. Mike straightened, jaw tightening. He scanned the dark beyond the ravine, his instincts prickling. "Someone put him here," he said quietly. They expected the storm to finish the job. Evelyn followed his gaze, her sharp eyes narrowing. "Then tonight," she said, her voice low and grim, "luck wasn't on their side." Ranger gave a low growl, pressing closer to Daniel as if echoing her sentiment. Above them, the wind screamed across the bridge, throwing fresh snow in wild spirals. Below, in the shadowed hollow, 3 lives held the line against winter. An old medic. A soldier who'd forgotten he was one. And a shepherd who refused to quit. Together, they kept a single pulse alive while the storm tried its best to erase it. The storm spent itself sometime before dawn, leaving Silver Creek buried under drifts that swallowed mailboxes and muffled every sound. The world woke to stillness, the kind that comes only after fury. At the edge of town, the Silver Creek Medical Center stood like a squat sentinel against the mountains. Its windows glowed amber in the early morning gloom, and a column of steam curled gently from the vents above the recovery wing. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant and brewed coffee that had been sitting too long on the burner. The rhythmic hum of machinery filled the quiet hallways, for drips, monitors, soft footfalls of nurses moving in quick, controlled motions. In a small room near the end of the corridor, Officer Daniel Hayes stirred. His body looked impossibly fragile beneath the white sheets, skin pale, lips cracked, face mottled with the yellow and purple map of healing bruises. But the monitors at his bedside told another truth: the pulse was steady, the fight was still on. His eyelids fluttered open. The world came back in fragments, light, sound, the faint ache of IVs in his arm. He blinked until the blur sharpened into shapes. A heavyset figure sat slouched in the chair beside him, a styrofoam cup dangling loosely from one hand. Sheriff Tom Grady. When Daniel's breathing hitched, the old man straightened immediately. "Easy, son," he said softly, his gravel voice gentler than most had ever heard. "You made it back." Daniel tried to speak, but his throat was dry, his lips splitting as he moved them. Grady reached for a plastic cup of water, guiding the straw toward his mouth. Daniel took a small sip, grimaced, then tried again. His voice was raw, but the words forced their way out. "My boot. Left heel." Grady frowned. "Boot? You mean your gear?" Daniel shook his head weakly, eyes drifting toward the corner of the room. There, standing silently, was Mike Roar, lean, weary, his clothes still smelling faintly of cold and wood smoke. He had been there since the medevac brought them in, watching the monitors, saying little. When Daniel's gaze found him, Mike straightened. The young officer's lips moved again, urgency threading through the whisper. "USB. Hidden. Left heel." Mike's jaw tightened. He stepped closer, resting one gloved hand on the bed rail. "We'll find it," he said simply. At the foot of the bed, Ranger stirred. The shepherd had refused to leave Daniel's side, even in the sterile hum of the hospital. His coat gleamed now, brushed clean, though his body still showed exhaustion in every slow breath. At the sound of Mike's voice, one ear lifted, amber eyes opening with recognition. Just then, the door opened and Dr. Lena Portman swept in, a tall woman in her early 40s, her dark braid pinned tightly at her neck. She carried herself with brisk authority, a clipboard tucked under one arm and a small gold locket glinting at her collar. "5 minutes," she said firmly, checking Daniel's vitals. "Then he rests. Whatever business this is can wait." But when she saw Daniel's expression, eyes wide, desperate, something softened in her face. She gave a single nod. 5. No more. Mike didn't waste a second. He crouched beside Ranger, running a hand through the shepherd's thick fur. "You hear that, partner? Boot. We're going back." Ranger's amber eyes locked on his, understanding flickering behind them like a spark catching kindling. His tail thumped once against the floor, silent, certain agreement. Within the hour, Mike and Ranger were back on the trail that led toward Iron Cap Ravine. The storm had blown itself out, leaving behind a forest sculpted in white. Moonlight glinted off the snow in 1,000 brittle facets. The air carried that crystalline stillness only winter knows, every crunch of boot and paw loud enough to echo. Behind them, a small patrol followed, Deputy Laura Bennett at the lead. Her ponytail was tucked into a knit cap, her hazel eyes alert despite the sleepless night. She had argued until the sheriff relented, refusing to sit still while one of her own lay in recovery. "Grady's putting everything we've got into this," she said, trudging beside Mike through knee-deep drifts. "If there's evidence out there, we'll find it." Mike nodded silently. His mind wasn't on the storm or the cold, but on the message Daniel had fought to deliver. Beside him, Ranger moved with renewed purpose, nose low, breath clouding the air in even bursts. His body language had changed. No longer searching, now tracking. They reached the ravine where the bridge loomed overhead, its beams groaning faintly in the morning wind. The flare from the night before had burned out long ago, leaving only a dark scar melted into the snow. Ranger trotted ahead, circling near the base of the slope. Then suddenly, he stopped. He sniffed once, twice, and began digging furiously. Snow flew in quick, efficient sprays until something solid emerged, a black patrol boot, half buried, its laces stiff with ice. Mike knelt, brushing away the frost. The heel looked ordinary, rubber worn smooth from years of service. But when he turned it in his hands, his instincts hummed. He drew his multi-tool and pried gently at the seam. The heel split open with a soft crack, revealing a small, foil-wrapped object hidden inside the hollow. Mike peeled the foil away. A USB drive, its metal surface dull but intact. He held it up to the light. Laura's breath caught. "That's it," she whispered, reaching for her radio. "Sheriff, we have the evidence." "Repeat, we've got it." Back at the station, the contents of the drive lit up the department's ancient computer monitors in glowing lines of damning proof. Photographs. Scanned ledgers. GPS coordinates. Trucks. Routes. Payments. The files painted the entire smuggling ring in chilling detail, names linked to shipments, shipments tied to drop sites, and every path converging on one place, the old stone quarry outside Silver Creek. The tunnels there had been abandoned for decades, or so everyone thought. Sheriff Grady stood over the desk, one hand braced on the edge, eyes hard beneath his heavy brow. "That's our hub," he said finally. "They left Hayes out there because he got too close. They wanted him buried before he could talk." He slammed his palm against the desk. "But now we've got them." Across the room, adrenaline crackled through the team. Deputies loaded rifles, checked radios, and strapped on vests. Laura tightened the velcro of her Kevlar, her face a mixture of resolve and fatigue. Even Sergeant McKenna, usually stoic, loaded shells into his shotgun with a grim set to his jaw. Mike stood near the back wall, silent, watching the organized chaos unfold. It felt almost too familiar, the hum of a briefing room, the taut current before a mission. He hadn't worn a uniform in years, but the rhythm still lived under his skin. At his side, Ranger stood tall, alert, tail still, ears forward. When Grady mentioned the quarry tunnels, the shepherd's head tilted slightly, ears flicking as though the word itself carried scent. Grady noticed. He looked at Mike. "I'm not supposed to bring civilians," he said, voice gravelly but steady. "But you and that dog," he paused, clearing his throat. "You've already done more than half this department tonight. We could use your eyes, and his nose." Mike met his gaze, then looked down at Ranger. "We're in," he said. Ranger's tail gave a single, solemn sweep. That night, under a sky veiled by thin clouds, a convoy of snowmobiles and SUVs crept toward the mountains. Engines muffled, lights dimmed, the town's defenders moved like shadows through the cold. The quarry rose ahead, a gash in the mountainside, its cliffs jagged and black against the white snow. Somewhere within that darkness, the truth waited. And for the first time in a long time, Mike felt something familiar humming in his chest. The readiness that comes before the storm. The night wrapped itself around Silver Creek like a thick, black shroud. The stars were faint behind high, fast-moving clouds, and the air carried that metallic tang that comes before more snow. A narrow convoy crept along the frozen ridge, SUVs and snowmobiles gliding over ice, headlights dimmed to slits. The engines were throttled low so that the only sounds were the steady crunch of treads and the quiet breath of men and women bracing for what waited ahead. Inside one of the SUVs, Mike Rohr sat in the back seat, Ranger beside him. The shepherd stood braced against the rubber mat, amber eyes fixed on the horizon, every muscle alive with anticipation. Mike's hand rested lightly on the dog's shoulder, feeling the low vibration of a body wound tight for duty. He hadn't worn a uniform in years, yet this silence, the hum before impact, was carved into him. The shared breath of a team on the edge of something dangerous. The measured calm that lives just before chaos. In the passenger seat, Deputy Laura Bennett rode with her map spread across her knees, headlamp clipped to her beanie. She had memorized every tunnel, every emergency exit, every slope that might hide a retreat. Her jaw was clenched, the kind of focus that came from fear worn down into purpose. Ahead, the lead vehicle slowed. The convoy came to a whispering stop. Through the windshield, Sheriff Tom Grady stepped out into the snow. His heavy parka ballooned with the wind as he raised a gloved hand, signal for silence. The moon caught the gray in his mustache, turning him into a silhouette of stubborn authority. Behind him, deputies dismounted quickly, rifles slung, boots sinking into drifts. The air filled with the soft clicks of safeties and radio checks. They had reached the lip of the old stone quarry. Jagged walls of granite rose like broken teeth, and from one of the tunnels, faint smoke threaded upward, almost invisible against the dark. A low hum followed, the telltale vibration of a generator buried deep within the mountain's gut. Grady lowered his voice into the radio. "Positions. Quiet. We move on my mark." Ranger jumped down first, landing light on the powder. His nose worked the air in sharp bursts, reading currents no human could sense. Mike followed close, rifle slung but safety on, his lamp dimmed to a red beam. They moved together across the quarry floor, weaving between abandoned cranes and piles of rusted equipment half buried in ice. Ranger's tail stiffened, the signal he'd found something. He veered left toward a narrow tunnel, its entrance half collapsed under a curtain of old timbers. Mike froze, raised a fist, halt. From within the tunnel came the faint flicker of light, bulbs strung on cords, their glow leaking through gaps in the boards. Voices followed, low, careless. Men too sure of their cover. Grady crept up beside Mike, his breath a fog. That them? Mike nodded once. Ranger gave a single, muffled growl. Then we end it, the sheriff whispered, and spoke into the radio. On my mark. The seconds stretched thin. Then Grady dropped his hand. The night erupted. Floodlights blazed on. Shouts echoed off the stone. Sheriff's Department. Drop your weapons. Inside the tunnel, chaos answered, metal scraping, feet scrambling, curses colliding with the roar of engines trying to start. But the exits were already sealed. Deputies poured through the mouth like a breaking wave, rifles raised, flashlights cutting into the dark. Mike moved with them, Ranger at his heel, both silent and precise. The dog's nose led the way, weaving through shadows and crates stacked high with contraband. Hands where I can see them, someone yelled. Figures burst from behind a truck, 3 men in heavy coats, faces half covered. One swung a pistol up, but before he could aim, Ranger lunged, teeth flashing. The gun clattered to the concrete as the man screamed, collapsing under 70 pounds of controlled fury. Hold! Mike barked, and the shepherd froze instantly, standing guard over the subdued man, growl still rolling in his chest. Across the cavern, floodlights threw everything into harsh relief, dozens of crates, barrels marked with fake shipping labels, bundles of cash and bagged narcotics glinting under plastic. Then a deeper voice cut through the noise. Too late, Sheriff. From the far end of the tunnel stepped Dean Harker. He was broad-shouldered, in his late 40s, with iron-gray streaks in hair that might once have been black. A jagged scar ran from jaw to mouth, twisting his expression into a permanent sneer. Years ago, he had been a rescue volunteer, the kind who hauled strangers out of avalanches. But greed had turned his knowledge of the mountains into a smuggler's map. He stared down the line of rifles aimed at him, eyes flat, calculating. Drop it, Dean, Grady warned, voice like gravel rolling down steel. No one else needs to die tonight. For a heartbeat, Harker's gloved hand hovered near his holster. Then Ranger's growl deepened, vibrating through the tunnel, primal and certain. The sound froze everyone. Harker's eyes flicked toward the shepherd, the amber gleam that never wavered. His fingers twitched once, then loosened. One by one, the smugglers followed his lead. Weapons clattered onto concrete, the echo swallowed by the stone. Cuff M. Grady ordered. Zip ties snapped. Radios crackled. Deputies swept through, cataloging evidence, prying open crates. Inside, cash bundles, narcotics, ledgers, proof stacked to the ceiling. The old quarry, once echoing with the clang of stone cutters, now rang with the crisp cadence of justice. Mike stood near the entrance, breathing hard, rifle lowered. Ranger paced beside him, tail low, head high, eyes sweeping the perimeter until every threat was neutralized. Laura approached, her face streaked with sweat and frost, a grin breaking through exhaustion. If it weren't for him, she said, nodding toward Ranger, we'd still be chasing shadows. Mike looked down at the shepherd. Ranger sniffed at a crate, then sat, tail brushing the dust, gaze calm and bright. He never lets anyone stay lost, Mike said quietly. Outside, dawn began to gray the horizon. The storm had passed, the snow glowed pale blue under the first hint of light. By the time the convoy wound back toward town, prisoners shackled, evidence sealed, the valley was stirring awake. Windows blinked open one by one. For the first time in months, Silver Creek exhaled. And somewhere in the back of a truck, Ranger rested his head on Mike's knee, the medal still unearned but already shining in spirit. Morning crept over Silver Creek like a soft confession. The first rays broke across the ridges, brushing the snow with gold. Smoke rose from chimneys again, curling lazily toward the pale sky. The storm had stripped the town bare, but what it left behind felt quieter, cleaner, like the whole valley had drawn a single, grateful breath. Inside the Silver Creek Sheriff's Department, the heater hummed under the drone of paperwork and fresh coffee. Evidence boxes from the quarry lined the far wall, labels marked confidential in thick red ink. Deputies moved between desks, trading small smiles they hadn't worn in months. For the first time in a long while, the silence here wasn't heavy. It was earned. At Grady's desk, the sheriff signed the last of the reports and leaned back with a sigh. His joints cracked. The weight he'd carried for years seemed to lift slightly, replaced by something lighter. Laura stood nearby, flipping through files. When she caught his look, she smiled. "Can't believe it's over," she said. Grady grunted softly. "Over for now. But I'll take it." He looked toward the window, where snow still clung to the glass in crooked patches. His gaze softened. "You know," he murmured, "I've seen a lot of storms in this town. Never thought one would bring us a hero with 4 legs." Laura followed his eyes. Across the street, through the frosted glass of the diner, a crowd had gathered. Inside, Ranger lay at Mike's feet, tail curled neatly, eyes half closed in quiet contentment. His fur gleamed under the hanging lights, brushed to a proud sheen. Mike sat with a mug of black coffee in hand, the steam fogging the window beside him. Daniel sat opposite, arm in a sling, face still pale but alive, awake, and smiling. Their table was covered in breakfast plates and folded napkins, half-eaten pancakes cooling beside them. The kind of simple, ordinary mess that only comes after extraordinary nights. Evelyn was there too, nursing tea, her gray eyes sharp but relaxed for once. She watched Ranger the way a craftsman admires a finished work, not for perfection, but for endurance. The bell over the diner door jingled, and Grady stepped in, brushing the cold from his coat. He carried a small box under one arm. "Morning, Sheriff," Mike greeted, rising halfway. "Sit down, Marine," Grady said, waving him off. "This ain't an inspection." He set the box on the table and opened it. Inside, wrapped in navy velvet, gleamed a silver badge-shaped medallion stamped with the words Service and Valor, Silver Creek. Laura, who'd followed behind, smiled softly. "We thought he should have something a little more permanent than a pat on the head." Mike looked down at the medal, then at Ranger, whose ears twitched curiously. "You hear that, partner," he said. "You're official now." The shepherd tilted his head, tongue lolling slightly, as if to say he'd already known. Grady knelt beside him, old knees creaking, and fastened the medallion to a simple leather collar. The metal caught the morning light and threw it back in a quiet shimmer. "There," the sheriff said, straightening. "Now the town remembers what you did. What you all did." Daniel's voice was rough but steady. "I owe you my life," he said, looking at Mike and Ranger. "If you hadn't come, if he hadn't." Mike raised a hand gently. "You'd have done the same for me. You're a good cop, Hayes. Just bad timing." Evelyn smiled into her tea. "And a bit of divine luck." Grady chuckled. "Luck had nothing to do with it. That dog's got more sense than half the men I've ever worked with." Everyone laughed softly. It wasn't loud, just warm, real. The kind of laughter that fills the spaces storms leave behind. Outside, the snow had started to melt. Water trickled down gutters, glinting in sunlight. The air smelled faintly of pine and wet stone. Mike stepped outside with Ranger, letting the cold bite their faces. The shepherd trotted ahead, tail sweeping lazily behind him, nose lifted to the wind. Daniel came out next, still moving carefully, his left arm bound tight. He watched as Ranger bounded toward a snowbank, pawing at it with sudden puppy energy, sending sprays of white into the air. "He's something else," Daniel said quietly. "Yeah," Mike answered. "He's everything they said about courage, just quieter." They stood together in silence for a while, the town behind them humming faintly with life. Then Daniel turned to him, voice low. "What now? You and Ranger going back to the cabin?" Mike shrugged, the hint of a smile curling his lips. "For a while. He's earned some peace. Maybe both of us have. Maybe, Daniel said, watching as Ranger trotted back, a stick clamped proudly in his mouth. But something tells me the world's not done calling for you yet. Mike chuckled. We'll let it ring a while. He took the stick from Ranger's mouth and tossed it far into the snow. The shepherd bolted after it, paws kicking up glittering arcs of powder. The medallion at his collar caught the light, silver against white. Evelyn stepped outside then, wrapping her scarf tighter around her neck. You should both rest, she said gently. You've given this town back more than it knows. Mike nodded, eyes on Ranger. He did the giving. I just followed. She smiled. And that's what makes a good team. The three of them stood there for a long moment, the soldier, the healer, the young officer. Watching as the shepherd circled back through the snow, stick held high like a trophy. That afternoon, the local news ran the story across the state. A retired Marine and his German shepherd uncover the trail of a smuggling ring after rescuing a missing officer from a blizzard. Authorities confirm dozens of arrests. The hero dog, Ranger, was awarded Silver Creek's Medal of Valor. The footage showed Ranger sitting proudly beside Mike as children crowded to pet him, his ears flicking gently as he endured the affection. Mike stood a few feet away, watching quietly, hands in his jacket pockets. There was pride in his eyes, but also something deeper, a stillness that comes when a circle finally closes. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the valley turned to gold again, Mike and Ranger walked the ridge above town. The air was calm, the snow soft beneath their boots. He stopped near the overlook where the bridge's steel ribs still stretched over the frozen river below. Ranger sat beside him, gazing down at the place where everything had changed. Mike rested a hand on his neck. You saved more than a man down there, he said softly. You saved what was left of me, too. Ranger leaned into him, a small, wordless answer, the kind only old friends understand. The wind moved through the pines, carrying the sound of distant laughter from the town below. And as dusk folded gently around them, the last light of the day caught the medal at Ranger's collar, turning it into a small, steady flame against the snow. A reminder that sometimes, even the coldest nights can lead you home.